Trần Thị
Ole chibaivek ole zanina kan webinar ron chim tu zong te amasa in chibai kan book chewa tin zanina kan thupui soitu tur Dr. Marina Ngursang Zeli Behera le Dr. Lal Clay Puite abikin chibai kan book chewa zanina Mizoram mi puite tan le zirlai te tan thungai nom tak mai le trangkai tak tur min soi chua sak ngei kan be se ya chutiang tur chuan du sakna kan hlan bok chewa tin kan HOD PNH lalram muani te le ka tho pui te le zirlai te le college danga kan tho pui te le zirtir tu dang zong te po zanina ma sain chibai kan buk chewani kan thria thewangin he kan webinar hi Mizo Tawng Dinhmun le Hmathlir te nia international webinar on Mizo language status and prospects te akhania nizan lama khan bul kan tran to nizana khan Mizoram Youth Commission chairman Dr. Vanal Chanpuya khan ahong to ti chuan nizan lama ngai nom tak mai le hlok thak tak mai in program kan mang to zanina resource person thatak mai patni kan nei le boka ti chuan zanina po program thatak mai le kan ta na tangkai tak tur mai kan ngai thak le thei ka kan han be sei bokani tin hei zanina hian zirlai te le college danga kan zirtir tu te mai baka Germany lam thangin he pi marina I ron troi om tu te hi kan neya Michael Bill ania pu Michael achunga kan lom hle mai I'd like to say a warm welcome to Michael Bill for joining us thank you for joining us ani hi Germany de chang in aron tel boka achunga kan lom tak zet ani ti kha kan soitel bokani chu le amasain hei hun kan nga zok theina turatan le kan resource person tena hunan nei tam zok theina turatan kan program ang hian kan kal chhom mop mayanga thupui soi turin Dr. Marina Ngursang Zeli Behera kan som donanga ani hi flyer lamate kan mu to ang khan research tutor MPhil stage leader Oxford Center for Mission Studies Oxford UK ania tin associate researcher Pretoria University South Africa mi ani boka tin amahi transformation ti journal academic journal editor achel mek boka tin ani hian le khabu pakhat interfaith relations after 100 years yakha alo buat sai to boka hemi webinar kan nei don hian kan in bia kan zuk soma ani he trul em maya tun lai pheichon hei MPhil tele PhD interview tur tele thil chikrang an synopsis te chupa ka chuan viva vose tele thil dang ti in atrul hle maya tuna kan program zola ma po hian program dang ala neya chowang chon kan han so manga a program nei angte han mang zowanga aman model chuan ani po min kalsan mai te po trul mai the chu tiang khop chuan a program atai ta tin UK a umna a khumi Europe ramhun sang hian paper present tele academic thila azin kwal de ureng mai boka chutianga mitru tak mi buai tak mai chu ania zanina helaya ahun lu tak mai sengin aron tel thei a kan lom tak zetani ti kha kan soi ani te chuan zanina hian pi marina I thu pui tur hi Mizo Tawng nam ni na le nun phung hril tu Mizo language the essence of culture and identity ti khania ani hi linguistic lam akha a specialize na ani ran palova ama poina soya amaro chu hemi Mizo diaspora kan ti mai Mizo khovel mun danga omte atang hian Mizo Tawng Dinhmun anron clear dan tele Mizo Tawng hi nam ni na le nun phung hril tu poimo tak ani theidan te hi soi thei tur zinga mi le soi thiam ber tur le hreber tur zinga mi nia kan hria da wangin kan soma kan som na te ngai poimo min ron ho thei le zanina lo tel thei hi kan lom tak zet ani ichuan Dr. Marina Ngursang Zeli Behera in buat saina angte thupui soi turin ilo somang
Thank you very much for the warm welcome. It's humbling to be welcomed in with such kind words, and yeah, I'm happy for the opportunity to be able to share my presentation with you this afternoon. So I have been looking at the main theme, which is Mizo language, the essence of culture and identity. And I will be looking at how Mizo language has been a source of identity formation for the Mizos, and how some of the language has been transformed because of Christianity. So I shall start sharing my screen. So I will be looking at the topic, as I have said, and I will do a little bit of introducing the language and identity. Then I will look at Northeast as a space of cultural and linguistic history. Then I will look at the Lusai and their dialect, then translation as negotiating identity. And I will be looking at specific words, Mizo words like Bia, Y in Tui, Puan Sukni, and Tibai. And then I will end with a short conclusion. I start my reflection on the basis of the thesis that there is a deeply rooted connection between culture, language, and identity. Identity can be communicated in different media, like in the early Mizo case through clothes, hairstyle, and other non-verbal markers, as well as through dances or rituals. However, the world around is comprehended and expressed in language. Language is the ultimate basis for communication among the members of a given group, the medium through which they discern what belongs to their shared culture and what does not belong to it. Language is culture, which is turned into words, and at the same time, the medium in which we reflect on what identity and its various markers mean. In today's world, and especially in multicultural and multilingual contexts, like for instance, India, language is a contested issue in identity politics, and people fight for the recognition of their language as an essential part of their identity. The loss of the Mizo language would be equal to the loss of the Mizo culture. We can, in a way, say that endangered languages are similar to endangered species. Once they're gone, they are lost forever. This brings me to an obvious paradox I reflect with you in English about Mizo language as the essence of Mizo culture and identity. Should we not be doing it in Mizo? But then again, if we would be the only ones to understand what we are talking about, it would be difficult to assert this identity, the Mizo identity, in the midst of other identities. No one would understand us and will be able to grasp the full meaning of Mizo identity. We need to be able to translate cultural concepts and the meaning of our shared cultural memory in order to negotiate and to preserve and to even defend our identity. I would say, as a Mizo, we are obviously able to translate Mizo concepts and narratives, symbols and meanings into other languages. It is very clear and evident to me as someone who is moving between cultures and languages that I do not lose my Mizo identity when I switch to English and live outside Mizoram. On the contrary, it heightens the need to keep my Mizo identity. Mizo culture, it seems, is rooted in language and vice versa, and can be translated and comprehended in other languages as well. This translatability will be the starting point of my presentation. I propose to study Mizo language and identity through the lens of translation, and more especially through the translation of the Christian faith and its terminology into the Mizo language. Foreign concepts, foreign ideas, and foreign identity markers were appropriated in a process which went so deep that for the great majority of the Mizo, being a Mizo includes being a Christian. Studying these processes and appropriation of foreign religious and cultural concepts can be a prime example of how culture and language interact and develop. Most writers agree that the Northeast region has been neglected in the studies on history as well as a region, as part of the national history of India. Malsomdong Liana, in his cultural history, quotes approvingly Sajal Nak, a historian from the Northeast, who states that the history of the region has not been looked into as part of the history of India. Nak says, quote, such neglect prompted the historians of Northeast India to take up research on the area, but they failed to communicate them to the rest of India. Malsomdong Liana adds, within quote, as a result, Northeast continues to suffer from historiographical exclusion, but unless the stories of Northeast are integrated with the history of the rest of the country, a true national history can never be achieved, close quote. One needs to critically reflect on what is a true national history in times when a Hindu identity is declared to be the one and only true Indian identity. Here we see how identity politics use religion, culture, and language for their purposes. Such a hegemonic understanding of nation is not applicable for the universe of cultures, languages, and regional histories that form the Federal Republic of India today. The category of a national history becomes questionable for the Northeast, keeping in mind the partition of the subcontinent leading to East Pakistan, renamed later as Bangladesh, resulting in the Northeast to be connected to mainland India only by a small passage north of Bangladesh, often called the chicken neck. One could argue that this small passage creates, at the level of representation, the impression that the Northeast has a loose connection to the realm of mainland India and is, from the perspectives of mainland India, a kind of annex. Malsomdong Liana's interest is to write a cultural history of Mizoram and to describe the worldview of the Mizo. He raises the issue of the available sources for the pre-British and pre-Christian history as being oral sources in the case of the Mizo. Culture and language are closely interwoven, and language is a prime living testimony to the history and culture which is taught in the vocabulary and literature, be it oral or written, and its metaphors and terminology. How we comprehend the world is expressed by how we speak about it. The people populating the hill regions in the Northeast around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century shared the traits of being tribals. They had some common elements of lifestyle, for instance, the system of agriculture, and even comparable culture and religious concepts. They were and are members of a variety of related language families. One indicator of the Mizo identity is the distinction of the Mizo languages from the ones around which they share family resemblances. The languages of the Mizo tribes belong, according to linguists, to the Tibeto-Sinno language family. From their history and the shared memory of a common origin, probably somewhere in southern China, the language they speak hint to a closer proximity to the east, present-day Myanmar, and even China, than to the west, Bengal and mainland India. The Tibeto-Burman linguistic film was identified in 1823. However, the term Tibeto-Burman was subsequently used in two different meanings, one by scholars following Julius von Klaproth's polyphyletic framework, and another by scholars operating within the Indo-Chinese or Sino-Tibetan paradigm. Van Driem, whom I quote here, compares the different languages in the region to the leaves on a tree. His metaphor appeals to me because its tribal identity was in a way confirmed by the diversity around it. Just look at the family of the Mizo-Kuki-Chin languages he lists in this manner. You have Kukish, Aka, Mizo, Kuki, Mizoram, and Indo-Burmese borderlands. You have Mizo, Aka, Lushai, the Lai, the Sijan, Aka, Silin, Tado, Tidim, Chin, Aka, Paite, Aka, Sok, Aka, Kamhau, Haka, Chinbok, Laizo, Laker, Asho, Kumi, Chin, Mar, Anal, Laker, Aka, Mara, Falam, Vaipei, Lam, Ang, and Simte. So I'm not a linguist, and I'm aware that some of you might not fully agree with his list. I, however, take one lesson from this list. It appears to me that the various tribes took pride in their identity expressed in a language that was only spoken by one tribe or a small group of them, along with their traditions and cultural products as expressed through their clothing, songs, and dances and hairstyle. All these were expressions of an attempt to be distinct. In order to be distinct, they needed to be different from the rest of the related or close family. In contrast to this distinctiveness within a wider variety, we see that the Mizo language of today is one dialect or language that was chosen in the process of introducing Christianity. I will therefore look first at the language politics, which made the Dulian dialect to be almost equivalent with Mizo, and how that contributed to a development of a broader Mizo identity. As we all know, the first significant contact the British had with the Mizo was with the Silo chiefs of the Lusei clan, who by 1830 had gained military power and was ruling over the areas which today falls within Mizoram. Between 1871 and 72, a military expedition was directed against the Silo chiefs. From then on, the Mizo came to be known as Lushai, a derivative of the word Lusei, even though the majority of the Mizo inhabiting the district did not belong to the Lusei tribe. The British divided Mizoram into North and South Lusai Hills under Assam and Bengal respectively. In 1898, with the amalgamation of the two, the territory was organized into the unified Lusai Hills district and brought under the Chief Commissioner of Assam. Colonial administrators had given priority to end the constant village feuds and violence and to ensure peace and order in the district. In 1927, customary codes and practices of various tribes were also collected and compiled for usage in the whole district. All these administrative measures of the colonial rulers had the effect of engendering greater interaction and commonness among different tribes living in different autonomous villages within the boundaries of the Lusai Hill district. With the help of Christian missionaries, colonial administrators had contributed towards the popularization of education in the Lusai Hills, which was a great success. As soon as they arrived, the missionaries immediately set about standardizing the language by devising a primer and developing its dictionary. They chose the Dulian language, which was the language of the dominant Lusei tribe. The Bible and hymns books were translated into the Dulian language, popularizing this language all over the region and developed it as the lingua franca for the Christians and eventually for all the Mizo. This was despite the fact that the majorities of the inhabitants of the hills were not of Lusei clan and did not speak the Dulian language. This is a case where the language and the identity of the few powerful subsumed those of the less powerful majorities. The question that I cannot answer here is whether they saw this as integration into a larger identity frame or as a process of alienation from their group identity. In 1946, the leaders of the non-Lusai formed the Mizo Commoners Union, the first political party in Mizoram. And in 1947, the name was changed to Mizo Union to include the Lusei. The hope of the non-Lusei was, along with the contest for power against the Lusei chiefs, the incorporation of bordering areas in Manipur and Tripura inhabited by other non-Lusei subtribes into the existing Lusai Hill district. So this led to a process of constructing the Mizo identity and a pan-Mizo project. These appealed not only to those within the district, but also to include other Mizo inhabited areas and thus rally people within the Lusai Hills to their cause, Greater Mizoram. Central to public support that such attempts met was the term Mizo itself. This was a neutral term that most people had no objection to using. Interestingly, in this process, Mizo, meaning to signify the general population of the hills, being a neutral category, was promoted to an ethnic one because the agents of this move created a Mizo union, complete with its own cultural symbols around the myth of common ancestry, including adopting the Dulian language as the common language. Probably what motivated the leadership to use a Lusei symbol in an attempt to contest Lusei power was the place of Dulian in the lives of people. It was this dialect that had, over time and also under the influence of the missionaries, choice of that dialect as the language of the new union in Christ evolved. As the common thread connecting the people from different clans and backgrounds inhabiting the Lusai Hills and even beyond, the construction of an inclusive Mizo identity and language has been a remarkable feat of social engineering and one that does not find a similar parallel in the Northeast. Translation as negotiating identity. After having traced the language politics that led to the spread of one dialect as the Pan-Mizo language, I will discuss a few examples of the translation process of Christian concepts and vocabulary into the Dulian and ultimately into Mizo language. The examples trace the shift from a pre-Christian oral dialect to a written Pan-Mizo language imbued by the new identity of Mizo Christianity. Bia, which is used for worship. I start with a rather recent example of such a translation process, which touches on the question of how the Christian Mizo identity of today continues or differs from pre-Christian tribal identity. In November 2019, a Mizo pastor, while showing some European colleagues who had visited Aizawl, the site of the original mission compound in Mission Vang, Aizawl, told them that the ancestors had worshipped the devil at that place. The pastor looks back at the Mizo tradition and believes from within a Christian worldview. It is, however, to a certain extent distorted. The statement of the Mizo pastor is based on semantics. The pastor's explanation resulted from the missionaries' translation or association of the term worship with the Mizo word bia. In the pre-Christian era, bia meant to talk or to communicate and was a general term also used for communicating with and not venerating the spirits. What I mean is, it doesn't mean venerating the spirit, it just means communicating with the spirits. It did not refer to a ritual that could be understood as being conducted at a certain place and being directed to a power that would be analogous to the figure of the devil. A concept like what the English term worship denotes did not exist in their worldview and vocabulary. In the Mizo language of today, bia has been expanded to translate the English term worship. Even though Christian Mizo of today tend to understand the host of spirit their ancestors feared to be under the rule of Satan, they in general would not say that the ancestor venerated him and his host. So this pastor now, when speaking in English to the non-Mizo visitors, used the English term worship when he spoke about the ancestors dealing with the spirit, because the missionaries had used that word to translate worship, bia, to mean worship in a religious sense. To me, this incident is a good example that translation is not so much about replacing one word by another. It is a good example of how a religious and cultural concept was translated and then rebounded by declaring something to be part of the pre-Christian Mizo identity. Today, Mizo continues to use the Christianized Mizo language and use the language at the same time to identify where they differ from their pre-Christian ancestor. It is also an example of how the devil or Satan was brought into the Mizo world via a process of translation. and became a figure in the worldview of the Mizo, who did not even have a word for the devil or Satan. Though the Mizo did not have the concept of a chief evil spirit, Satan was translated as Ramhwai Lalpa, which literally means Lord or Chiefs of the evil spirit. So we have the second word, Bia, Hwai, and I would just like to connect it with the biblical spirit. In an interesting paper on how to interpret photographs of early Mizo-Christian, Kyle Jackson brings a similar example from the early days of Mission in the hills of how the demons of the Bible were introduced into the Mizo worldview by a process of translation. Commenting on the photograph of the Mission Veng Biak Inn constructed in 1930, he observed how dangerous it must have appeared to the Mizo to have so many windows through which, according to their folktale and belief, the spirit could enter the building. Like the church windows, the church's New Testaments were not immune to the infiltration of the Hwai. In the Mizo language, Gospel of John, one of the first books in the Mizo language, Gospel of John, one of the first books of the Bible to be translated, Jesus' response to a crowd accusation is, Ramhwai Zol Kanilove, I am not possessed by a Ramhwai. The demons of Galilee literally became the Hwai of Northeast India in this text with this translation. Then we have the word Wayan Tui. I now turn to another example of translation, which indicates a transformation of the Mizo identity. You are all aware that Zu, the rice beer, played an important role in many of the festivities among the Mizo. For example, for the 5 feasts that the Tawng needed to give for the whole village in order to attain his title, Zu was indispensable. Drinking the Zu rice beer was closely associated with singing and having a good time together. This was the case not only during the feast, but on other occasions too. In the missionaries' perspective, Zu was not only consumed too often, but excessively, and they associated it with what they considered to be a pagan rituals and demanded the new Christians to stop drinking Zu. But then there was a problem. How would then they account for the report of Jesus drinking wine, which is in the Bible? That was difficult to explain and led to an important decision in the first Bible translation. So in a purposeful lexical distancing, the wine of the Last Supper and communion was translated into Mizo from English, partly phonetically as wine tui, not just as wine, which is supposed to be alcohol, but it's as wine tui. While sweetened water was used in the ritual. So Jackson, whom I quote here, called it a lexical distancing. This distancing was actually part of a whole new attitude to drinking, which for the missionaries was best introduced into the emerging Mizo-Christian identity by using a non-Mizo word in a phonetic rendering. This seemingly small point was part of the process leading to a dramatic change in the social and communal practices of the newly converted Mizo-Christians, among whom drinking was banned, but singing and dancing continued to be practiced. Puansuk ni washing up day. In my search for example of translation of cultural concepts, I found in Jackson's paper an observation which resulted in an interesting translation that intrigued me. It seems as if the early missionaries translated the noun Saturday by Puansuk ni, which literally means washing up day. A name of the day Saturday was translated into a practice that should be observed at this day. The background to this was the missionaries' opinion that the pre-Christian Mizo smelt because they did not wash enough. There are several reports of missionaries commenting on the strong smell of the Mizo. They therefore attempted to change the practice among the Mizo, on the one hand, on the basis of an argument that washing was a sign of being civilized. They, however, also connected cleanliness to the concept of purity and godliness, which betrays certain preconceptions of the white missionaries. Ironically, the Mizo had a different perspective. There is a report which turns around the missionaries' argument. The report states that a Mizo left a room saying he could not stand the smell anymore, referring to the smell of the soap which emanated from the wash-up Christians. As early as 1903, a new compound noun had crystallized in the Mizo lexicon, the foreigner's smell, which is used to refer to the missionaries' use of soap. Again, this translation are a good example of how concepts and practices are translated and how this is reflected and promoted in language. In the long run, it became a sign of the Christian identity that they were clean, unlike the non-Christian Mizo, who were considered as being dirty. I will close my observations on translation as a process in the negotiation of a new identity, impacting language on the one hand, and at the same time being reflected in it with another example. The photo of the Mission Vang Biak in which Jackson opens his paper from, which I have been quoting, shows a signboard above the pulpit with the word Tibai. It is a very common word of greetings that people exchange. Tibai has been introduced into the worship language, where English-speaking Christians would say to God, "We worship you." Mizo say, "Tibai kan bukatse," literally meaning we give you greetings, but conveying they worship. It's more than greetings. Similarly, and equivalent to the English words, "Let us worship God and bow our head in prayers," the Mizo would say, "Pathian sibay bukin ilaw kunang u," which if literally translated would mean, "Let us bow down and give greetings to God." But actually, what is meant is, "Let us bow down our head to God in worship and prayer." Taken together with the observations on Bia, with which I started my reflection, it is another sign for attempts to translate a concept for which a word has to be found, because there was a gap in the Mizo dictionary. In order to translate worship, Bia and Tsibai have been used with slightly different meanings. In the context of worship, Bia means worship in the sense of explaining or describing whom you believe and address as God and have faith in, whereas Tsibai Bu can be understood as the act of worship. I opened my reflection by stating that language is culture turned into words, and at the same time, the medium through which we reflect on what identity and its various markers mean. I then looked first at the language politics, which made the Dulian language to be almost equivalent with the Mizo language, and how that contributed to a development of a broader Mizo identity. My argument is, however, that with the development and spread of the so-called Mizo language, the Mizo identity was transformed. The examples of the process of the translation of Christian concepts into Mizo language demonstrate how this went along with a new identity and how that was reflected in the language. Mizo language is the core of Mizo identity and culture and vice versa. This identity is, however, dynamic and has been transformed in the process of adapting translated cultural and religious concepts. These are reflected in language. In what sense language is imbued with culture and offers a semantic universe which is reflecting and indicating changing social practices. Thank you.
Hello.
Thank you for Ms. Marina Behera
Oh,
for your informative and inspiring presentation. It was very interesting to hear about your experience, your observation or your message was exactly what we needed to hear. So I remember your arguments. Mizo language is the core of Mizo identity and culture, and the language is culture turned into the words. we remember. Thank you for your presentation. We hope we have a good program again in future. Miss Marina chunga kan lom hle mai angai nom hle maya kha a presentation kha aro pui hle maya kan lo ngai tha chiang in kan lo en ulukin karinga culture hi identity language hi identity le culture at nuk pui tak tak ani zia te chung chu thiam tak mai ngai nom tak mai na ron soya ti khan khami asoya tang khan zodu nei te kan emo khamia tanga soibel du nei te kan omani chuan hun in honglok te ang
kalau zon lok te ang hello anh sẽ thấy mò
pudar chuai lovaren thei
kalau zot te ang
ko ngain pudar te email ron tilang theng em ti chuan in screen a khani lang thei anga
angor akor hi ole lang to em
lang
lang to Marina kan zo du chu missionary tin translation le education atan dulian an thang ati kha khongai na source min thil them o dulian ani kan dulian an titil rengim ti ka missionary te kan zot tel boke
tuna hian tuna ka paper a hian a source mai kada lawa ma se paper dang pakhat kaziak to a chuta chuanin language lampang as an identity marker ti hi kaziak to a chumi chu kane chuta chun a source su kada me ka ma se tuna hian tian kazong humai kazong han enge han en mai arem chang vak lawani chuwang chuanin milongai dam meila nakina nge pu Dr. H Laldin Moya nena reference to karon thondonia
ole kan soina chan tu anni missionary te kan dulian anti kring lowa dulinan tianga maratangan la kan ina langa chu wangin khami an ti po khalu sei ti lowa dulian ti I than jong na chanakha ania kan ria du na chan takachu
hetia okay sorry het paper kan hanzia hi chuanin ti nge ashang term kada mai lovin term tuna nge widely accepted term ang hi kada mai thina achan chu footnote da chuan ka soifia thina in ma se han present out term shan han soi hianin angai thatu te tan hian a confusing thin wang hianin tian dulian language hi current thlang ta mai ma se a footnote reference a hi chuanin ka soifia ve no thina ma se han present hi chuanin han soifel kha chu a harsa in akwal de do wangin dulian ti hi nge consistently in current mang ta mai achan chu abuai thak na chan to intinan English sources kan nei dana pohen chi shrang hian an zia ka azia dan hi an in anglawa ma se ka ti dan tlang pui chu intinan foreigners so writings ka en po hian mizo ina an ngai dan le mizo words hi ka mang tlang pui de ubera chu wang chon in ania du lian ti hi kan than akazia dan mizo ina an sha tiam am dan hi missionary te khan mang dem lo ma se
ole alom me chang fia via vin ka ria zona zot du dang kan lo mem le an zot zel ro kun ala tama in thrung lo ula mizo trong khana zo the ni ti kha lo ria ula thaw me Dr. Zoram din thara te khan soibel du tenem le paper kha ngai noma achiang khat vi ho ani karinga ngai nom ka ti hle maya ka lo ngai thatui khop maya ke point ka hlok puya kha tin kan tumang tak mai khan ngani mizo trong hi cultural identity kan ni na feel tu le chumi ne na in kung kai dan te khang kha thiam tak mai na ron soya ngai nom hle mai Soi du kan lo chuan I would like to invite Mr. Michael Bill to have a short comments about our webinar and about the topics. Michael Bill, he's from Germany.
Thank you for the invitation to share a little bit of my thoughts, and thank you for allowing me to join in your seminar for which Marina has invited me. I found that reflection very intriguing. I mean, the Mizo language is not known to me. So listening to you, I just get the feeling of, wow, sounds very good, very interesting. I would love to understand the language. But what I understood from the presentation, that what I find very intriguing is this idea that to consider language as, so to speak, a kind of a storage house of semantic memories, and that therefore the language is also reflecting the dynamic changes that an identity can undergo. So with the translation process of Christian concepts into the indigenous language, the language and the identity shared, and that is reflected in language. And then this dynamic process I found very interesting, and I think that is something to follow up, even maybe in later times when there have been an oral language, as I understood correctly. In the beginning was an oral language, not written down, so that it developed a script and literature. So probably with the development of writings, the language also has changed, and by that affected let's say the identity of being a Mizo. See, I know a little bit about such comparable studies in Europe where they show that with coming into the state of being a written language, the vocabulary has exploded. So that the dictionaries grew and grew and more words came in. And I think that probably would also be something that you could study if you continue this idea of a dynamic identity based in language and reflected in language to develop further into the present time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Michael Bill. Thank you for your comments and joining us tonight. Thank you so much. Zo du neite soi du neite kan lo memle nakina atop lama po la zo thei thova tin chat box lama po khana zo thei pokaniti kha kan soi du ani oleti khan Dr. Marina Behera chu tikhan kan du to phot mayanga kan next topic lama khan kan kalle anga adot lea kan resource person tu kan thu pui soi tu tur hi Dr. Lal Tei Pui ania ani hi tunlaya chuan hemi language seminar te webinar chungchanga chuan somlo tak mai ania kan hre larin karinga ani hi MA linguistics ania tin PhD linguistics ani boka doctorate linguistic lama kan nei zinga kan chuan vor tak mai ania Hyderabad English and Foreign Languages University Hyderabad atanga PhD po hizo ania tuna hian ICFI University assistant professor na athok meka tin le khabu thadeu mai Mizo Tawng chungchanga peichuan ron lo le tunlai huna kan mamo em mai Mizo Tawng ri ziarang ti akha chumi le khabu po chu ati chuak to nge ya tunlai hemi Tawng chungchang zirna muala peichuan mi teron lo le kriadlar tak mai ni azan ina ahun lutak sengin kan zinga thupui soi turin lo tel theya kan lom le maya ain buat saina angte soi turin kan somanga tichuan kan soi to angkhan zona hi Tawngka azo dutan azo theya tin Tawngka ni lemlo azo du kan omani point chat box lama po khan aron zo zel the ni ti kha lo shele ta ila tha ome Dr. Lal Tei Pui lo somang. Ala in mute lat mai
Di khan chi the
di khan kan the
zanin hian PowerPoint presentation current prepare lawa kanom sampak lawa hian don nai chu ka bai pui la tok the lawa PowerPoint presentation current sei mok mok anga min lo ngai thak kyan sak ka be sei dawa zanina ka thui hi Mizo Tawng linguistic analysis lama Hmathlir ti ania azir na lama Hmathlir kan sei ma hian heng lama malak atru na san kha kan tar langa masaberin pimrenai poina lo sei to trong le culture language le culture in kung kaina kha kan sei chawanga kimi in kung kaina le ahum hal apoi mo na kan sei chaw do ni kan namzia rang tuna po khanan lo sei to ta language le culture in kung kai zia an dan te an sei ta kan namzia rang te kan practices tia kan chin than le kan culture te chung nen hian ain kung kai ta hi kan cultural identity pakhat ani ta hemi ani awang hian ke mani mizo kan ni na sei fi a hai lang to ni ta ni kan chung hi hemi awang hian kan namzia rang te vong nung to chuan chung hum hal hi apoi mo le ni trong khum hal chung cha hi mi thiam tam takin an boy puya trong thi to te an zira athi chan ten zir boka khovel trong tam zo he tu na hian aral mek zelani abik takin mani trong kum hal na chang shelo le orthography ziak nei lo hi aboral tam zo te neta little le remain 2000 khan an paper an zia an lekha mun zia kum zanga kalta chung khan khovela trong chan ve vel hi boral ngin an chuda David Christian 2000 a hian kumza lo om to re han kar ni dana hian trong pakhat zel hi boral to rangin alo chute boka tin crossan 2002 a khan het tu nang zela kan kalani chan trong hi zaruk le claim amang to tam tham tak om ba ki chu boral vek an boral vek rin tholo se bokani henga dam chhuak tora angai langsar zo zinga Indo European trong English te Spanish Portuguese heng hau ba ka hian Chinese te hi andam cho arin thu so ya heng hau ba ka hian amang tu an omdar na satawangin Hindi le Bengali te po UK lama mangtun tam em ma heng awang hian andam cho arin thu ase boka tiang mi thiam te na estimation kan ti shillok na lok na temela hetiang estimation ngai to chuan mizo chung mangtu te hi kan claim em ani kan claim em awang hian kan chung hi abor la om le ni to na ya chuan mizo chung hi chung chang ani e kan tia mase UNESCO hian endangered language asiama list asiama chung list siam ji nga chuan mizo hi vulnerable no ya hian ala da boral thwai tu chu ani lem lawa tu na ya chuan amero chu heian adin mun hi ader thong ani eti atar langa vulnerable chunga hian dinhmun der thong tak endangered a om le ta heng ho te pe chu theme tur an ngai ho jing an da ta heng dinhmun der thong taka om te dinhmun siam tha tur chan mi khiam te hian mani trong zero le man hi anda poimo seberani tin mani trong le zero kan ti hian khami trong thiam tur vazir much ani lawa literature lampang te linguistics research lam thinghan lamtheng ma son hi akok tani literature lama chuan kan chawang ma kan son na sa hewang te po hian ania poramate panan soya kemani literature lama ma kan la ka wang hen mizo tong hi tong chang ani e chang lai ni kan ti chau amero chu kan sha chawang in linguistics lama hian awareness and om lo bang te po nya kan la no fol le ani linguistics analysis lama hian ani chuan kan la no fol kan te awareness om lo kan ti ta linguistics chu engi ani ta ang hi zona onta linguistics kan ti chu study scientific study of language kan te scientific study of language kan te a chuan formula omsa mangin trong sang an zir chinta linguistics a chuan trong hi pon lam outcome kha outcome atringin a chung lama sentence te word te mo tone information zong alo chwa dan hi kan chui chhuak chinta ni linguistics a chuan trong hi trong hi trong ri kan mante mo akhuk te ri kan rem khom dan te engwanga rechen khat man mangdun thenge kan nia engwanga rechen khat mangdun thelo nge kan ni ti hi zirna lo om to sa atang khan kan bi chiang thin ni linguistics a chuan linguistics in atumber che nge kan ti chuan trong kal mang zir chiana om zenia heng kan zir kan thil zir chwa te hi chhop ani ta ni linguist hian trong hi mandan dik anzir tir ngai lawani amai ro chu mi puitena chongan mandan kha kanzir tlang puita ni linguistic hian chuan linguistics ti hian subject bakhatemo ti hi aol ta mase huam zau em the linguistics ti hian linguistic ring hian specialization nature ta chungo chuan relay thumal relay thuk lampang zir mi te thumal lampang zir mi te sentence structure grammar khoi mi te namboka heng ba ka na dang tak kan omani linguistics kan ti hian grammar chu hi linguistics em hi kan ti chin hian ka shede watun la ya chan amero chu hemi ba ka hian language history te social linguistics kan ti ang chi te relay thuk thumal mo heng thuk le thumal te omzian na in kung kai na thleng hian zirna shan ania area shan chaw ania azau em ani hemi atanga kan share to poimo chu linguistics hi area pakhat ngor subject pakhat ngor khung thei ani lawani achunga hian subject shan na oma azau em ani chuwang linguistics kan ti hian grammar ngor kok lauta achunga khan thilzir tur tam taka omve ni mizo wa te po hian drama te engi mizo subject kan ti chan drama mo novel kan ti ta poetry te kan ti ta khanga omang deu khan linguistics hunga point morphology syntax morphophonology main general dewa a subject pa ka khan a subcategory angkha omvele chok boktani linguistics tung sang tuna kan soya tuna mizo subject nena ain kung kai thei dan kan soi chawanga engtin nge linguistics hi mizo subject ta kan anchang kai ve ang ti zone hi omta poimo te bokani thei soi tama shat za hui poimo ko ti le a ka soi fo ma se soi non fo nga hian ka sha ma se bera chuan linguistics hi english subject noya hian a anga ngai nahi alian em ani tuna po hian linguistics kan ti chuan asapri a shat ngai nahi le em ka shat tu po hi mizo subject student emo zirtir te po zo te linguistics ti hian english riawa ngai nahi nei thintani english subject po hian ani na taka chuan anda sang de ulexi hian english paper hian english subject hian paper pakhat anzirtir ve wa hian emuchina chuan english noi omang hian ngai na chen hin nei ve de thauta amero chu literature nen akal mang ain an lo ema ve hian avai chuan an pom thei bik lawani helaya soifia ngai ta chu linguistics chu trongkal mang aziarang zirna ani awang hian trong shim big subject noya hian aleng vek ani hindi ani emo mizo ani emo english ani emo linguistics hi trong chui chen ani angin heng chunga hian akhung thei vek ani hindi ani emo mizo ani emo english german te poni ro se heng trong zirna to shim language subject ani chuan linguistics hi heng noya hian aleng vek ani tin soifia lengai pakhat chu English subject noya hian linguistics hi anda kan tita English subject noya anda hian English linguistics anzir chinani English linguistics anzir kan ti omzia chu thumal rile thu le grammar thleng hian subtrong kan ti me English language lam veki anzir ti chinta hi achan le wang chu English subject noya paper pakhat anga zir ani wangani mizo subject noya hian linguistics hi data ilang thu grammar thleng hian mizo tong hoi zongin linguistics hi zirtir ani theidon ani mizo subject noya kan da chuan English subject noya kan da logic kalmang chuan linguistics hi mizo subject ani me don ani mizo subject noya mizo thu grammar thlenga kan zirtir chuan linguistics hi mizo subject kan khung thei reng don ti na ni masters china chuan linguistics ti a hian BA level a chuan English noya kan ti tota amero chu masters china chuan ashan lakina kalta subject shan lak MA linguistics kan ti ang chi te kha ashan lakina kalwa hian trong pakhat chau zir ani ngai lawani zau to ka hwamani masters china nga phejan ka personal experience training karon senga MA masters ka zir la khan linguistics kan zir hian theory te a framework te manga trong zir thui jan himin zir tirta heng min zirtir na hian English language zir to lawin mani chunga cheu khan min apply tirta linguistic subject noya khan mizo trong ka zira kabulawai no thu khan enge ani trong man kha azir vele thongchin tina ni chu a theory framework application kha mani chunga cheu kan apply chinta so me ni lawa kan professor pakhat KGV ani chu 2014 nge 15 mani khana pension to athia no to ka phonology le morphology hi akhoi kopta hybrid subject morphophonology hi khoita kan exam velanga phejan trong hi aphwa chopa made up language te meta exam na a chung atong phwa chop chu min zir tir ta thin ta exam tin a hen atong phwa chop a khag dang lam zel ta chung atong phwa chop te chu a phonological structure te a morphology lam thleng hian zona ran siam ta question hi pakhat na tanga sum hi thleng hian a inzom pu hian a siama pak alai ho kan ti dik lo chuan nu zong zong ha dik lo vek ti to na nya ti na ni to a then question number 1 kan ti dik lo chuan question number 1 number 2 kha chan dik ngai na om lo thin ni a subject a test hi har the em ma amero chu tu ma khan bial kan hmai lo ani a subject a khan a chan chu kan professor khan I khami kan chan dik ai ma chuan kan linguistic analytical capability trong chui chian kan thiam na khami technique kha a endober ani thin wang ani students then trong chui na an technique thiam an ron apply kha chuan an apply na an mang dika an man dika an application an ron soifia thiam chuan ani chuan dika apong thin ani kan chan na kha hetalo chiang te chu linguistics hi English zirna ani lawa trong zirna ani amang trong kai thiam apang tan trong zirna le von chatna man ro chatakani linguistics hi mo chan tuna linguistics a Mizoram Dinhmun kan sai chawanga envainia Mizoram linguistic awareness kan mamo tilam kan sai chawdona masapera chan kan attitude hi kan siam thatanga in ka sha attitude kan ti hian kan clear dan trong kan clear dan kan ngai dan chonga kan ri su khek dan hi siam thatanga hian ka sha school level lam soila timetable hi kalau inveno to school level anga hian school level ti akhan ke class 1 atanga class 7 vel ne so and timetable hi kan ena khenga hian mizo subject hi atla puin kar khata hian voi khat anneya anei tam ho chuan kar khata voi ni ten anneya amer chu atla puin english hi ni khat kar khat ni khata hian voi khat anne nge ya voi ni nei te pon amani school pakhat phe chu a school bing soi lang lo mela anni phe chuan subject dang zong zong a hian English a hen emphasis and penasani so am timetable a hun 95% za sum pa panga kha English subject tan hian anda ani so tiang khop chuan English subject hi kanin zirtir na sani school level achang hian he hian zirlai tia English subject a subject pa ka achong ngai poimo na kha atu nget ta tani English hi a poimo lo ka ti na ni lo heta Mizoram po na chhakilang English chu poimo lu tu amai ro chu tiang emphasis English subject ka kan pe tang hian Mizo wa hian peve thei tai la he tiang ani lo chuan kan Mizo tong lut lo na hi kan chalai tia school level achang hian kan tu ring ti na lo ni do na trong kam chuan Mizo chung hi apoimo mani warang chu kan ti forma se kan action kan thil te a hian alang le 3 sin lo la hi ni a chuan chuan kan action a hian tilang thei tai lang hi achan lian takani hian ka sha achan pakhat lian te zinga pakhata chuan kan study materials hi achat tok lo wang hian ani in ka sha pakhata chuan chu kan point ni na kan lu na tora ni ta kan study materials te hi materials shim hi du ang tok hi man torom lo ni language student te tan college le university level han sei te la college le university level a paper zia emo college a research kan be hian zirlai te tan hian du to ka man to materials hi om lo tlatani ka personal experience training kan sei lenga PhD ka ti khan lexicographer le tong si kan discourse tuna kanin biak na tuna ka chunga kan ti tin ang level anga hian analysis ti kha kangai ta chuta chan tong si chu PDK 1989 le 1992 a phonological perspective phonological theory gold in theory aron siam sa ba kha chu 1992 mulama hian ton shim hi muma taka hanzir chen ne hi lowa kasai so lo to rangai la PDK de chau kha motor kha kania 2013 14 board hovel khan grammar lam ni se PL changte in a research be ba ka tlim dan oma amero chu extensive the grammar boy pui hi an lo lo ani chumi an lo awang chuan du khop khamu tu khawang em ani lexicographer khoi tur po khan chuwang chuan discourse analysis khoi tur po khan he ta kan ni tin kan ti tin ang khoi tur khan abula tangin tones tonic prominence te hengba ka lexicographer theng khan ashan pa in bele chiam kha kangai ta khan hun tam takal hekani materials ka omsa chumi se also takin kar ni thum vela khan kazyak anga ka no khat themi to khanita amero cho I material omsa ani lo wang le kan trong hi analysis chút yang research wak ala ni lo wang khan han rin tu kha om lo ta zir tur kha tam pha ni chu kan chan te ai khan ke lo po hi har san tam tak to khi an ve hi ka reng thawa hi kan mizo trong zir na materials la claim zia te kan ne chun po abe thama researcher te tan po ala tok lo zia hi atar lang chiang hle hian ka sha ke ma personal experience atang pun personal testimony kan te me ke ma personal experience atang po hian achiang hle in ka sha ni kan materials kan ne te ala be thama ala tok lo zia hi English te chungai to ela paper hanjak donila wang de hian anzirna sa tolu to ka English to zir tur chang omdon bi anti fam tho chin ani amera to theory tharalo chwak zela clear dan dang clear na in anzir zela zir dan to tharalo om zela ni paper eng po jak donela meros English anga te chon du khop to reference material hi to on tlak ni mizo chunga ero chan tun kan din huna chan linguistic lama kan page te zera te po hian an mamo basic materials po hi an du khop an malawani an research ti lai ba ka heng an mamo si hi an research ba ka khan an khoi te langai ta how tak em china ni PhD kan te PhD how tak za kon chawanga an topic po kha how tak ti to na ka lai khan achwang lian pha khoyangai chinta an du angzir the tur khan akar ol no kha tur kha lo tam tak em china ni chuwang chan an mani topic pa ngai ba ka khan thil dang tam tak kha an zir tel kha angai chau china ni kan cha tham dan o samber to ra chan chunglam headline mi zero han tum ta amero chu an noi lam le alai hol kha no kha na tur mei kha lo om lo chin ta kha no kha ngi kha ngai chin box sia chuwang chan how ta ka boy kha kle ani chen khatina kum thuma an zo the topic inang reng si po kha mizo subject linguistics subject mizo subject at research data tan kha chan umma kum rok be kha ngai chin ani chan materials kan soya locally available materials bazar lama kan mu thei chin hengte hi kan nei chen khat te hi empirical evidence om chin lawani fin fiana om lawani linguistically fin fiana nge research base hi om lota research timek te tan hengte hi ashan pa azir thatle proof le ve ka ngai chin ta ni research backed up ani lo chan thesis anga chan hoi taka man hi a har sa china ni thesis level anga chan hemi awang hian mizo trong zia rang kan grammar te kan sentence structure te word formation semantics thang hian malang na tur le mason na tur hi ala tam hle ani adang le a chan atlang puin linguistic research kon da kan i reng hian English vekin paper hi zia chena ni ta kan local language mizo trong hian ziak mu tur hi om chin lawani hian mizoram om tile mizo subject la te ban pha khana da lo ta hemi awang te hian kan materials om sa te po hi man na chang te hi kan shat lo pha bo kani materials te kan ban pha ka chan chop chok thei lang chan chop chwa thei hi kan study materials te po hi achat le zo ke renga chuwang chan materials te kan ban pha ka chop chwa hi ngai poimo achu le hian ka sha tun alat tun kan din muna hian mo materials te hi mizo student te mo hemi te ban pha ka chop chwa hi achu ka te hle ni kan ma mona chan kan soi chawa tuna trong zirna lam kan mathira lo chau tai lang mizoram hi van doina le van ni na kan nia sumi kan van doina le van ni na pakhat chu mizo trong hi scientifically a zero vakhi ala ni lawani van doina lam chu kan sha chawanga du khop materials on lawani research tiwa kan ni lawa wang hian kan zirlai te baka kan zirlai te kan zir tir tora po du tui har sa china har san tam tak kan to kani van nei na lam ve thonga chan mizoram hi trong zir mi te ta na le chalu tuk me hi ania khoi mang alani lo wang hian le chalu tuk ania so wang chan linguistic study in po hi ti do ni lang thil thar la ti ngai lo vekhi ani me ani kan chanu supervisor payton asoya kan chanu bula hian it thesis idu ber vala top la framework library mi vala top la so mi chon mizo language hi izir top donya thil thar vek lo mizo language a chon explore ni alani lo wang eng idu ber thesis vala la so mi chu a framework copy in kami a thesis a research conduct a methodology thlen khan copy la mizo trong iti zon a thar vek ani atita hetiang khopian ma kan lak thiam chon opportunity kan la ne chalai tam tak hei trong zir lama tuite hian so dang chan trong zir na lama ma son thei dan chen khat kan lo tar langa ma sabera chuan ma son tur chan linguistic study lam hoi zonga trong zir hi achul to ani mizo chalai te tan hian textbook le research material man tlak chok tur chuan trong hi a ler atanga kan zir ngai ani a ler atanga kan chui chen ngai hemi tur hian linguistic subject hi mizo chalai te ban phaka chop so hi achul tak me wani linguistic subject au mani chuan trong zir na kong le kan trong kan shet melama hian nasatakin min chok jang khai don ani hemi ba ka hena second point da chuan kan trong te hi aspect shan more area shan a features shan a characteristic shan hi linguistic analysis hetiang shan linguistic analysis kan nei chuan school atanga college thang hian an level mil zela zir tu kan chok thei don ani hemi tur hian research lama nasataka mala ka ngai ani tin trong zir na lampanga target mumal tak nein research te now emo pui tham deuh hlek te po funded project angzong te po hian kalpui thei te lek henga hian linguistic nge hi research titor hian rain nasataka mala ka tul ka tia tun kan din mana chan linguistic nge tinge ka ti kan ti chan linguistic nge hian research ti atul na chan chu claim kan nei thina ni claim kan nei chu ani theng a kan ti ang chi hi ani ta claim kan siam reng hi hypothesis ang vekani hypothesis ang vekani a framework mumal tak ne na kalpuya chui chiana empirical evidence ne na fin fia veka tulwang ani heng kan claim te kan hypothesis ang hi claim ngor ani a proof emo evidence emo a omlo chuan
mute low
mute sak them ane claim angor ani a proof emo evidence a omlo chuan linguistics form chunga chuan ani lo chin ani tin hypothesis hi result anga proof omlo a all samjok wanga kan chin ani chuan mizo chalai tele tongzir mi te tan hun local zel tura harsana tam tak a thlen the ani hypothesis le assumption te manga textbook te kan siam chuan kan zirlai tam tak te hian speculation hi ani anginan pomdona hi a fulo le hian ka shebokani adot le a chan trong hi a lera tanga chui kan tia a lera tanga chui kan ti chan clear dan dang omta I ri lampang zong te pona kok theya history lampang hoi zong te pona a kok theya historical linguistics kan ti chan chui dan he ashan lom le synchronic period from big ne for example internan 1990 atanga 2010 hemi in card hi synchronic study ani theta diachronic ani leta diachronic a chan a trouble atanga chui etymology a chui na omleta chunga chan chongkan mandan in thak chaudan angchi heng hoizong te po hian mizo language hi omzenein chui the ani heng ba ka hian enge ri kan ti angchi te po ka khang hoizong te po khan a lera changa chui kan ti chuan kan chui dan azir kha hoizong khan clear dan sang oma enge a ler kan ti kha a in thak ve the ani cho chuan trong hum hal atul kan tia trong hum hal tu zan documentation te kan soin se mema documentation che enge kan ti zan zia le or report kan ti ta hengte apoi mo he rolin clearly le atan chan trong document cho hi atok lawani achan chu trong hi chung nama changa chui tian na omno chan a trong document a chang remote thi chan a internal function chung lama in kung kai dan past tense kan lo siam dan te plural kan ti dan te present tense a grammatical category aton group te po nyang tone marking te po kim chang taka shia thi a har chin ani tin athok lam te po zir chian na emo zialan nemo omlo chuan thomal le sentence document atang ringo thi chuan shia chian harani documentation hetianga written documentation hi atok lawani hangi trong thito document si azerating Paul Mulhouse 1992 han paper a top down approach to language survival akhan alo soi lang ve to bokani hetiang written documentation te atok lo zia te linguistic research hi apoi mo nge ani language preservation atan ti kha hemi paper a hian chak te hina zia kani linguistic research hi ado appoint le a linguistic research hi school emo college level emo chau hi a hlok na tel torin nilomani preschool thing hian mson le hlok na a thlen theni ton la ya chan preschool kan war emema no le pa te pon an fa te ho preschool an lo tir na sa anin ti mu chau le henga hian phonics anin zer tir thin ani phonics enge kan ti chan ri lamdan thomal lamdan ani ta English phonics zirna lama nasatakin ma anlani henga hian no panga hian preschool level atang hian sap tung thiam du na le atung run na kha tu na sa he ani he mu the khopin kan khotla nga hian alanga nangni pon in shat ve thau karenga hetiang deuh hian heng level a hian Mizo phonics te hi azir tir ve the ani level hian te atanga zir hetiang an zir tur chop chok tur hian kan phonological kan phonemic system kan phonic kan sound system mumal takasya mangaya he research level atanga puitlin thei chawani heta I preschool te pon an zir tur kha heta research level atang khan kan puitlin thei ni engwani kg po lalut phak lowen English phonics an zir thei kan ti chuan sub trungin Ahman Rishan Shanti Tsikimin Uluk Takin research Takan Lo Neto No Pangte Desert Tour Anzur Om Teka and Sopswak Tatani He Gemani Pohan Mizo Tungahan Kan TV Tayani Kan research Heta Kan phonemic system Kan sound system Kan Zir research Kan Bechan Ngat Zwan Rilam Pangkan Soitawa Next point at one Rilam Pang Zirna Kan Sayanga Rilam Pang Zirna at one Claim to Zirna Vetota claim azong chu koron soi Mizo tong ri ziarang po kha ri kan soina ri zir na chu animeta khanga khan e amero chu kan ri kan phonemes te hi kan nei kan phonemes nei te hi shat me tok lawani uluk takin an ziarang hi lazir hi atru tak me wani hetianga hemi phonemes te hi kan nei ti kha atok lo an ziarang shat atru la Mizo a chuan consonant som thumme mo som thum pakhat mo kan nei ti kha tok lawa heng kan ri nei te hian khuk engtin nge khoidang lam thomal tira omle thomal topa om khan aziara nga in kha kem ti te ri lamdana kan taksa peng sang kan chet dan te bora kheta e kan lo khoidang lamdan te khang khan uluk tak zir tham fe ni ri ringu ta po hian ri chungchang shim po hi tun lai han in na tam hle a entir na pela kan alphabet a ek mo glottal stop remote po hi tun lai a chon kan boy puina save hen ka sha heng hi phonetics lama tang chon soifia thea ka ngaya ki chon Mizo alphabet a ek mo English in a G and T hi ki ni san ek ania Mizo alphabet a chon ek hi glottal stop ani ashan pa hian ga hi tun na ya hian nizana pon soi to thawa tun nai te hian adjective le adverb chen khata an manga indonan gwai ge gwai tiang chi te ma se tam lo he ni heng ba ka hian nam ming soinan gang te heng ba chumi ba ka chan loan words kan tiang chi trong kan pu grab tiang chi hawanga tian man ani le ta phonetically chuan ga hi kan phonemic system khunglu tur chuan Mizo trong ngor en hi chuan thil ngai to a fel ngai hi atamani antirna tuna te pom trong mandan dik lo kan tia pom chen khat kan ne pom chen kha a chen kan pom si lo amero chu mana an kan pom ang zel ang khat tun no kan pulut zel don ani chuan ga hi kan phonemic system a hian om thei lo ani thumal enge kan loan words te po hi kemani kan linguistic system kan language inventory kan lut theidon lo ani chuan ga hi kan phonemic system a khunglu tur hian thil ngai to fel nga hi alatamani amero chu hei strictly ngai dana ni ta strict lo takat kan ngai to ave thung chuan na china kan sei tak adverb le adjective ne mo ge gwai kan ti ang chi te pok aron am chauta chungba ka loan words tam tak kan nei ta gate kan ti te grab heng te poi tun lai chang kan mang na se em ta heng kan consider chuan gari hi kan phonemic system a hian kan khunglu thenga consonant hi som thum pakhat kan nei do na ni omze a chuan alphabet a ek baka khan gari hi ashanin kan pangtel ti na ani ek hi adiklo ti na ani lo ek hi Mizo hian kan ne ni chuan kan boina bera lang ta chu English na G and chin chiana kan a letter a alphabet hi kan zo sap ti hian Mizo tung glottal stop chin chiana na an lo man wa hi ani berin ka sha he hian min ngai to tir ta chu kan zo sap te an local khan gari hi kan manglo emoni o ti hi ngai dan min te dewa achan chu lo mang ni lang chuan gale ekhi an clear shan hi min clear shan sakhi ka ringi tlatani achan chu matinge kan ti chuan kan zo subject khan English an mangani English an chiang takin glottal stop le voiced velar hi an mangani gale ekhi an clear shangani so wang chuan an ni ina an ri akami an system based de khan an run siam nge donani e kan tone system kan phonemic system shat sa mang hian atang puin kan trong shat lo te po hi an system kan ze han kan ke mani trong ne han kan compare chin ta chuwang chuan an trong ne han an compare nge do na chuwang chuan kan lo mang ani nge chuan ga le ek hi min thlar sak hi ring ka tani ani lo chuan ngai dan dang lo le pakhat chu Mizoram chuang ringot po hian dialect atam em ta chuwang chuan gari mang lo te zinga khan an ron khosa anga ga hi an tel lo amani chu ti ngai dan om le bokta tin chuwang chuan hengte po hi ngai to na article 3 ve nei chu chuan adang le a chuan alphabet siam that chung chang po hi soyatam em ani kan shat tur chu khovel tamjok te a hian alphabet an nei te le an phonemes an rihman te hi a in mil lo tlang po yani English te hi enilang alphabet hi somni paruk ani lain phonemes hi somli pali la yan nei ni omze a chuan alphabet hi alphabet te an siam lai khan rough takin a hun lai mi thiam te khan an siam amero chu khuna local zelta zirna asanga alphabet chu hian an chung an rihman te kha a hwam kim lo hlet yan hu chhakta chuwang chuan pronunciation sound le kan lamdan le kan alphabet te hi thlershan anita ni zia ka chin chianan alphabet te an manga amero chu alamdan pronunciation te so hian symbol an mang ve thong tani linguistic study kan ti reng hian language study kan ti reng hian phonemes kan mang ta heta phonetic symbols kan ti hi kan manga amero chu min no pui chuan an mang lawa alphabet heta abc aob kan ti angkha kan mang thinta kan do chuan kan alphabet system hi kan rihman azrin kan siam tha thei amero chu kan siam tharo ro ni chuan kan rihman zong te hi da theila du thu samani hetianga script change lok to achan manipuri kan sai lang lo thei lo ta kumza thum chuang an lo man to script kha an thlak mai ani mase anni le ke ni han dang lam na lian deuh kan ne chu ta chan anni chuan meitei script man thin an lo nei ni kumza thum ma zong khan meitei script an lo mang to ta bengali script atanga an script man thin a khan an khan an meitei het an lo man to thin meitei script kha reconstructed in an letani meitei reconstructed script an thakani bengali script kha kini ero chuan script hi mansa kan ne lawa tuna kan man hi 19th century toblama zo sapte na min siam sakhat tun thleng hian kan lamang reng ani kan sei ba ka chan tun lai in hialna titam to sentence structure ang chungchang te po hi syntactical analysis mang hian a soifia theveka enge syntactical analysis kan ti chan soifia dan osam bera chan sentence zirchian na animeya amero chu he hian a soifia zo tak tak lawani ni tin kan in biak na hi formal grammatical rules manga zir ti na ni syntax so mo syntactical analysis kan ti chan heta tuna ka chung tuna ka thu soi po hi formal grammatical rules mangin azir theyani chuan hang grammatical rules te hi sentence emo clause emo apply in structure ani phungle kal mang te hi kan zir chiang thina ni hang analysis mang hian word order kan ti ang chi de sentence grammatical category shang kan rem khom dan te kan sentence structure SVO kan ti ang chi de asai the ni mania Saitwal college lama webinar ne chunga chan RKL nan sangi iflu shillong lampanga an scholar khan lo se to hemi sentence structure chungchang hi ani hi syntax ELT ni thawin syntax lampang hi akhoya atui emi ma thiam em boka mizo hi prodrop kan ni awangin OSV ani theilo atitani MS Academy YouTube lama khan clearly theino ma chiak takin asaifi ani ta khan he hian tarlan chu heng in hian ti hi omzenia saifi thevek ani ti hi ani chan hetiang lampang shimshima hian ngai to chan phrases mo noun phrase verb phrase te kan ti ta heng te hi mumal taka saifi ani hi alo omlo hian kasya hengpa ka hian manzana purematen an sailan stem 1 stem 2 verb form ang chi te po kha ahman hun ang te po hi soifia hi alani lo hian ka sheboka tin a manna mo chwata khuta kan ti ang chi te po position anga soi hi ani fo chinta amero chu locative marker ni ta hengte hi syntax lama mi thiam te hian zirchiana soifia te hi atru tak me wani RK kan junior neta syntax lampang ron khoi chawanga ron soi fia zel to rangai la tin sentence structure chung chang pe hi chu paper achwa thoi be sei la chuan adot le a chuan tunai kan boy pui le dang zezom to le to lo chung chang hi morphological analysis mang hian a soifia vek theni morphological analysis enge kan ti chuan thumal rem khom dan word formation zirna ani root morpheme abul azunga tangin engtin nge thumal dang alo chwa thek ti de hi an chui thin ni chuan morphological analysis a chuan morphological analysis kan ti hian zona pathum chan kan tum thina chungte chu hemi thumala hian thumal kan zir chena han piece engzange mal engzange heng mal shan shan ti hi enge an zia ti te engtianga rem khom nge an ni ti ang chi te heng zo hi morphological analysis kan ti hian chan kan tum thina ni kan zia zom lo chung changa hian milchat kan senior kan morphologist kan senior pakhat morphologist ka ron ani chuan theory based azir hian heng kan zia zom to le zia zom lo to chingcha te po hi azir dan sang omati ni chuan ama sapera chuan kan Mizo morphological typology hi shet chian trul atia kan hemi zia zom to le zia zom lo to chungchang akan ngai to masak ber to ra chuan kan morphological typology hi shet chian trul le atia hemi ba ka hian theory man to de ro hi aran propose chu realization morphology anita realization morphology che enge kan ti chuan word and paradigm theory chu Charles F. Hoketa siam chu anita ani chuan world and paradigm theory manghen asoifia the arin thu soya amero chu arin thu anita athil propose me anita arin thu chu ani awangin zirchian tak khuna chuan a theory dang de te pohman te lo ngai the ni chu wang chuan helam pang te hi heng te hi hetiang linguistically explore le zirna alo omlo awang hian in nyal na te po achwa tampha ani chuan adang le a chuan linguistics appoint nong berani chu linguistic study shan hian enge manghian heng linguistic study analytical levels of analysis shan manghian chikim takin Mizo chung hi azir thei ani chikim takin engtinge kan zir thei kan ti chon internal reduplication kan ti da reduplication chu enge kan ti chon thumal in ang voi ni kan lam ang chi adjective le adverb kan man hawang chi enge moi ti ang chi te mo khang hawang chi khani ta loi moi kan tiang ho ten da zirdan chi khat chaw om lawani phonologically in athuk lama zir theta athuk in zuidan te engthuk nge hemi reduplication a hen kan man ngai lo te ka phonology mangchuan azir theta reduplicated chen khata vowel te kan thak chin ta ni chu entunan nge ngwai kan ti ta henga ti han phonetic theory engmani ber manghen engwangin ye ta hen vowel kan thak ti kha ashiat ve thei don ta tin reduplication shim hi alexim mumal taka in rem khom da ni morphological analysis mangten azir chan le thei ani henganga kan tong te kan zir thei ani chuan reduplication chau lo po hi adang te po hi kim chang takin azir dan le clear dan azirin kan soifia thei don ani clear dan khat chau in kan clear to lawanga clear dan dang ka changin a internal structure le a function kha kan hailang to don ani chuan kan chunga hian engemaw chena chuan hetianga clear dan dang thumal pakhat rimut bo kan zir chuan kan sian pha don ani internal thumal pakhat hi a phonetic lam hoizong te phonology lam hoizong te morphology lam hoizong te semantic lam hoizong te hian zir tailang chuan soifia dan kha chi sang om don ta ni chuan ke mani po hi kan chunga khan mo clear dan sang lo om na kha chuan kan chunga khan kan chung kan shet thiam na khan kan chiang don ta ni zuwa za heta changa lo dang ta chu language kan zirna kan approach dan hi kan thaka chul te anita a trul he to hypothesis te hi result anga ngai ngut thi ahun to lawani chuwang chuan chanem ngai takin technical approach manga zirlai te man thei tur materials le khabu ani emo paper journal lampanga ni te pohian chopchwa hi a trul ni tin hengatan hian linguistics lama hian nasataka malaka chula kan linguist nei te hi kan nei chun te po hi man tangkai thiam chul he ka te ni kha ka se top na ni se en kalome
alom om hle mai Dr. Clay pui kan lom tak zetenia kha atir lama asoyang khan ani he dam sam chi alo deuh hleka chuwang chon janina po hian nuam samlu tuk lo chungin ron tela asoi kha poimo hle maya ngai nom boka tui om boka aron soi tam takha hela hian kalo chin chiama ro chu cái chuan cả soi vek lovanga han soi zui ve chak kha nga angai thatu zinga khan soi chak tak tak le zo du nei tam takin om karinga zona hun te kha kan han honganga chuba ka chuanin soi bel chak nei te kan omani chuan chung te po chu hun kan hong veka amar chu kan hriat ang khan tlei pu hin nuam samlu tuk lawa mar chu zona zual puite chu min chan sak te dura te po an be se thota ila tha in karinge ngai nom hle mai a soi zinga khan nizan lama po kan ngai thak to Mizo te hi engeni sap trong te kan da poimo sap trong te hi kan thiam turania kan ngai poimo turania amaro chu kha tlei puin study chi apo ni lo lo in kwal dewa ne ya kan routine system ate po Mizo subject hi kar khata voi khatte kan da line English subject te chu ni tin deu tho kan da ai in balance lo ai khuang ro lo em maya chuwang chuan kan kal manga hian Mizo trong hum halle choi nung tur chuan ai in tuklang dewa kan kalte chuba ka chon ni zanan soi bilingualism emo multilingualism zonga kaldan te kan zona chuta chon Mizo trong le namdang trong pui thiam bel tak chunga kan kal thiam poimo ti lamate nia Mizo trong hum hala tul kan ti lain kan thu soi le kan thil ti ain milo ni an ti chote tin Mizo subject noya hian linguistic hi da ni sela Mizo tan atangkai le don Mizo subject dan po atul in athani ti te asoya soidu ka nga mai soi chak po tam tak oma soi tangkhan midang tan hun kian zo kila thain karing le zona le chana hun kan manga zo du nei te tan hun hong le han zot ula in tharung le lovin MZ imu lama kan zirtir tu pusang zuala pachuaw mel kan huwa ani hi Mizo trong chungchang atele trong chungchang a chuan kan ron berle kan kan mithiama kan ngai ani ani khan han zo do mo han soi do mo nem le ming merin kan som te ang
zanin chu zo du le ti zong a khan kalawnga ngai tu che lawa tui deu khan kalawnga thari ngot maya angai nom thei khom maya te pui hi mania kanin muwa nuam sam lo om te hi lo ni reu boka kami ka khriat chak em chu tuna kanin nial na tamber zia dan chungchang bi ke morphology bi ka kha hei ai zau le hei ai thui hian a ran pa zui deuh bik thei hi nita sela chumi tur chuan ril ru in pu em a chan chu language chungchang a hian tuna kanin nial na tamber le kan soi tamber le kan in lung rual thei lo na tamber chu a zia dan chungchang a hian ya chu ta po chuan tlem thil tlem te a deuh chau hian
ai in mute pal hlo mai
alawin mute ni mo tuna engchin nge ka strong khalo lang ka hret talawa kalin hial na tamber zia chungchang a hian hei aya fel fai le hei aya kanzom tlan thei tur zonga chin fel dan tur hi linguistics lamatang hian a om theyang ti khai ron soya chumi chu khamilam hoizong khan ril ru in pu theyang em ti hi karon zo tani te uberana
putlo lampang po om chang lawa I nachena ka soyang khan Mizo trong hi zir tur hi latam em to na immediate dewa I kan ngai poimo turanga chanya zia zom tu le zia zom lo tur ania amara chu hemeti tur hian lelama chan how tak veni linguistic research hi remote po hi kumkhat kum ni vel benga ya I morphology ang hoizong azia zia zom tu le zia zom lo tur hi kangai dan chan morphology ang ngot chan amal morphology lang chuan asoi fia thei thawanga amero chu morphology le syntax kal kopian soi fia hi angain ka sha chuwang chuan I tiang lampang hoi zong chuan ya het ngai to chu ka ngai to ve thawa I kan chante po kan rona kan som ve china mero chu PhD delighten nia baka tianga funded anga project kal hey ingting kan tiang obligation nia na thok kan ni lo hi chuan thil thoso thi har ema ma se hetiang lampang hi chu kan khoi thoi tur rangai la kashat swalo chuan kan junior iflu lampanga po hian MA dissertation a khan kan morphological typology khoi hi anom ve thawa chung an paper te po chu chiar mizo helam mizo chung ti han let thelang chiar thei chuan amilang kan hlok pui chuan karinga ni chu pakhata cha step 1 chun ta se amero chonia in sayang khan kan khoi ve theizel turangai la morphology lampang te po hi syntax nen kal kopin morphosyntax lampang hoizong de hian kan soifia chauthe thoi turangai la mero chu sayang khan pakhat chuan mi pakhat chuan hau tak ve tak ania chawang chan project ang hoizong te hian kal theilang chu du thu samani
kalome tra hatianga ti thei hun tela om tak chuan local deuh taka pui bom tu han tan te po kha kan in huam ve nia khami kongjong a kha chuan riat ka mual te kha kan lo nei anga ma se systematic kha chuan kan thiam ve kar lowanga ti kha kan bel ve le ni
kusang zo la kan lo me zona thata karon zo ta chuba ka chuan nia ni china khan tlei pui khan soya mizo tong hi azir chian ngai le zir tur tam tak la omani ti khan nia chunga chuan tangkai na kan nei zel khapoi moni le zona zo du dang te kan lo mem le pure ma te ni zan lama kan resource person ten lo langa tin midang dang pu thuam te for ring ti te midang dang khain la oma zo du mo soi bel du nei kan chuan
kan host kan min phal sak chuan trem comment kan duwa zanin hi Dr. Marina le Dr. Leipui te hunania an hun lo lak kha kai thung view amaro chu mainom ti takin kalo ngai tha zanina hian hei thangthar tong lampang zirmi linguistic ron chuak zela hi Leipui na ron so Dr. Leipui so yang khanin an junior te po khami language ron khoi mizo bi ron focus te po anom zelo banghen thamon thak katia chu wangin thei topin ron beisela abula tangin mizo language hi mizo tong hi a ho salutuk kan te kan soi thina double adverb hi kan quote le ngot thina ma se chu tiang mai ni lo mizo hi a ho salutuka a ho sak nai kan la phor chuak don chawa chu atir lama sangka joko somli bare tangin linguistic theory manga shilfia tanna phonological studies teron chautrana mizo grammar ka khoi det in preliminary grammar ka Dr. Thangin 1986 aron sol chuaka masa ju pochu ain thasung ma preliminary atini achan chu a ho salu ka zaulu tuka me pakatana grammar khoi hi alien lu tuka ne hey grammar jek the hi kan tam khop me allo ma pur amar chu scientific study ni lu chuan afia thelewa in hial na ti chuak tu ani na tapo atam me mani amaro chu engkim hi scientific taka zira rema ti theive kan ni jan khan miss pani kanaya hemi noun phrase te sentence structure X-bar syntax te poka ka both sides sagaron tarlang lowa tin chu baka linguistic typology claim ko khoi lewa masake ma analyzing ka tia hey research dang dei Dr. Marina ten hen kan ti awangin linguistics ai kain ka tel theilawa ma se min han ti ta ga hen man le man no hen kan ti thina ma se ka du khoplo me ma ke ma poyan chumi chu linguistic typology chuan enge kan ni isolating kan ni agglutinative kan ni hey Vietnamese te chu isolating and Chinese po isolating and to the line Turkish te chu agglutinating ne engkimin bom fe kan chu ta chon mizo kha akhoya hing ge kan om ke chon isolating hi kan ni chi alo ba riat na kan ya chan chu inflection te ma derivational morphology te po kan ho wang hian isolating chu kan ni thei lo amar chu scientific evidence on win empirical data kan ne ngai kha zir chiang tur khan in dedicate ngai ni chu kam man to si lo ke mai chanem galo ngai ve mi chu ba thamon thak de zani na kan tu soi te ka ngai ma mizo trong hi a house tak zet a phonological rules te po hi chui fe tur lo ma khami verb inflection chung changa po kan sangka zo ko som lo in nial shep ตัวอันเราสวยไปตัวเราเวลคัดดรทางพวกนั้นแหละกับพวกนั้นเสียกันจุดกันที่เวททางโดนช่วยตัวเองที่ตั้งตัดติดตัวเลยเรามาเสียที่เดปโอ geographical aerial feature name เนี่ย political feature name ที่ส่งๆ analyze ตัวเรื่องกงช่างเนี่ยแต่กันตรงที่อาหารสานี่อาจปุยมโลนี่เดี๋ยวทำมันนี่แต่ชวนนินฟังทาร์เทนเราช่วยเจ้าดรเลยปุยเตะเราผมก็ติดตักซึชวนนินคอมเมนต์ประกาศกันใน presentation นั้นเป็นเราก็อะไรกับบุฟเฟ่สำเร็จการดีนามิโซphonemic chart คันนินเคค่ะ voice dealer คันนี้ดัดแล้วก็อีกส่วนนี้กันริงอ่ะทลายค่ะอินโมโตทวินกันริงอ่ะค่ะ voiceless ตัวนี้อินก็เสียจุลัยจุดเราเสียตัวสาธุแต่พวกกันริงอ่ะมาเราจุดตาขันนังปนมาร์ลามิเนี่ยเอกกิเตียเกยจุดชิมน้ำกันนี่มันจีกันเตียค่ะใครดัดเดี๋ยวเราเนี่ยจุดนี้สันพวกกันกัน point out นะจุดกัน borrowed words จังเสียกันมันสิเท่าไรตุนไทยตีก็จุดกัน natural inventory นะเดี๋ยวเราเห็นกันง่ายเงี้ยจุดอันคอมเมนต์เลยเล็กแต่กันทีนี้จุดกรณีโลกนี้กันเอาไหม
ก็เละเอกจงจางฮีบินเนี่ยนะตั้มเละเนี่ยนี่สินะก็ใส่อังคันกัน inventory ตัวที่เราสับเป็นนั้นเป็นวันเด็กลายคันนี่สินะก็ใส่ตัวอังคันก็หินนี่ลังจวนบินเสียลันสักเนี่ยฮีกระเรื่องนี้มาเสกัน alphabet ROB อ่ะคันก็คันเตลเราแต่ส่วนจวนไงด่านออกมาก็ไงด่านอ่ะจวนก็คัน inventory อ่ะเราแต่อเมริกาจุดตุนนัวเองทุ่มทาริกันกุยตากันกุยต่างอาจารย์เกย์กวยกันที่อังจีเขาที่เขาเรียนสอบตาขมีบากาคันที่เราประคัดก็ observe เลยอาจารย์นำมิงกังเตกันที่เขาวังจีดีไอ้ exclude เลยแต่ตอนนี้soกัน inventory กาalphabet ROB กาเราคันso วังอาจารย์ไงดันปนีตาจงอาจารย์กันอันรุ่นเขาคัน dialect zero กันเนี่ยอัน dialect zero เตคันลูเซคันก็มังโลนี่อันนี้โดนฮิติดังไงดันค่ะกันเนตาอันนี้เราจอนอันมานี่ค่ะก็เลยเอกมังน้ำมันในบ็อกซี่อ่ะขมิก็เลยเอกมังน้ำคันเอกเจ้ามินเป็กริงวดข้าจูเองชันในเฮียนก็เชเวเดวันนี้ส่วนจอนก็ voice revealer ค่ะกัน inventory กันเซงลุดโดนนี่จวนเกมานี่เฮียนกันจงอ่ะอัชเชนขัดจูเฮงฮิสแลงอันนี้กันตีอังจีเตเฮงจูสับตรงนี้มิโซตรงอ่ะกันคงลุดเทลไว้กันตีอังจีเขาเตปโอเองมุดเจน่าจงกันปมเตลเวหิงไงเฮียนก็เชียนิกาฮิกันเซงลุดเตลโดนนี่จวนเอกเล่กาฮิอาชันไปกันเนตาจวนจวนกาฮิกันโลเซงลุดโดนนี่จวนกัน loan words กันตีอังจี grab get กันตีอังจีเขาจงที่ฮีกัน inventory กัน language inventory เฮียนกันเซงลุงไงจวนจวนเองกัน phonemic system อ่ะก็ให้กันเตลโดนนี่กันอัลฟาเบตอาเตก็กันเตลโดนนี่จวนเฮงซงที่ฮีกันไงตัวเตลเวฟกันไงยันกษานี่สมัยจวนเนี่ยอิสเซอังเดียวกันปุเรมาเซอังเดียวกันเองอับุลชุดกันไงตัวจวนก็ให้จุกัน system จวนอัตเตลเทจิอะไรวะนี่อเมริกาเนี่ยกันเตลโดนจวนข้างเขาpossibilitiesกันไงตัวเวเท่าไง consequences สังจีติปค่ะกระชากยิ่งโอ้
ฮัลโหลไหมฮัลโหลดูไหม
อารมณ์เลยไม่พูดเรื่องมารอนคอมเมนต์นะเบ่งวาร์ทาก็ดรเลยปุยชานนะพวกเขาไงนมเลยไม่อะเกี่ย linguistic level เราถ้าชนไว้นะคันนี่จานะพูดเรื่องมาทุกสอยแต่ข้ากันเราสอยช่วงเวียดูนะสอยที่อาคารเนี่ยก็ข้ากันในเราที่ยังสอยอาคารนี่ตาเขามีอย่างเราคันจู่ๆเนี่ยกุยเตะที่ข้าเราเลยทุกสิ่งที่ข้าเนี่ยจู่ๆเจียนไงช่วยเจียนไงที่ตั้มตะก็เทนี่ที่อันรอนสอยอาคารจงน่านัสตักนี้อินกับเรียไอ้ลำเฮียนกันทันเซลพวกเขาไปหมดเลยนี่เลโซนจอดดูดังกันละอมเลหุนกันละหงอินทารุงลวิน
โซน่าประคัดกันไอ้เรื่องที่สเลปุยค่ะเสียส้มไม่ใช่ตรงเสียส้มเลยส้มเราจงจังเท่ากันนี้morphological analysis เลย syntax จังกบค่ะไปหมดเสียค่ะกันหันเสียเฮมิเฮียนินgrammar ตะปนยังเสียส้มเลยส้มเราจงจัง100% in solve ไทยเรื่องเสียส้มเลยส้มเราจงจังเบก้าเฮียนเฮ้ยอดีตเดอร์ที่เฮเอาไทยเรื่องเรื่องเลยเรื่องเราค่ะอินปอนดิสละอัศหันเนียนค่ะนี่มันชันสักไทยจนก็ลงมาดัง
theory kan mana zir chuan ki chu soifia the a ka ngai ni kha chu soifia the a ka ngai tilas kas a soifia the ka ring ani kan morpho syntax manga kan zir chuan also te in enge hemitsin hi ziazom tur ne hemitsin hi ziazom lo tur ni eti hi kan soifia the ka ring tlat morphology mong hian morpho syntax mong hian
Kole kalome.
Zo du dang kan lo mem le.
Zona din lo Miss Lei Pui kha kan student hi na Miss Nubai kan ya min chat ka ringa kan student lu ya hi kan swang mati te kha karon sai ve dua swanin ile khabu swa te po kan lo muwa congratulations karon ti do boka.
Thank you, ma'am.
Swan nizan lam kam bisa ka fa exam bangin zanin na inom ka ti makalo tui ve china tiang lama hian anyway zona ve de ulek pakhat chu layman de win linguist kan e boxi lawa chuan oral culture kan ne kan orality atanga hemi written in transition hian kan syntax well hi a impact na sa he easier na tanga enge mudan enge kan syntactical structure well mo enge athak dang lam na sai ni sia ti kha kan zot ve do sim
language shim hi chu a develop zel chu wang chuan kan syntactical structure hi orality atanga thil hi process anga kha chuan enge moni kha chu in thak om chu ka ring anina ango chuan orality atanga written kan lu khan anina ango chuan I khamia chonga kan man ango kha chuan a structure kha kan follow chi ai ka ring lawa chu me ne lawin mana orality kan lo man le tu na kan sentence structure po hi enge adang lam to a chu wang chuan enge thil enge lost in translation kan ti ang chi te po kha chu tam tak chu om ve chu ka ring.
Okay, thank you very much.
Chang chiang ka ria Miss Nu Poi he ya fel trin kom maya amin ron troy om thina webinar kan nei masa kumin mei kha po khan zantin mai hian lo tel thina lomom hle ni kan chunga lom thu kan se kan ei chodi miss anything khan zo do mo sei do mo an nein ka ria lo som lo kang midang po lo in ring ola zo du nei te kan om chuan
kalome zodu po ni lo wa zodu kan klem pya me zan in chu han zot viang sila kan do a kan lok pui le zwalin kan ringa kan resource person te patni Dr. Marina le Dr. Lepui te presentation angai noma kan lok pui nge yang ti pokarin oma zona kan nei lo wa angai nom ka tia chu ti ran chuan layman enge ni Dinhmun atang chuanin enge tuna approach tuna aron soi taka kha kan language approach kha kat lo tu to ziate tin technical systematic approach tu to ziate tin linguistic studies kan mamo ziate kha achiang le a karil ruwa chuan hei tihanin thangthar mithiam purimana asoi ang khanin thangthar mithiam ten ron suaka tin mithiam tak kan lo nei to te point than to wa chuti rwal chuan Mizo language board loading tur nen kan chong hi kalmang nei le omzemu zokin kal chodon ni in alang tarwak maya alom katia base na sang tak nen I Mizo language board loading tur te tin kan linguist mithiam tuna kan nei tele zirmek lo chhuak tur te po hianin kan chong ti mason konga te zirchian konga te mumale omse nei zoka enge min khai thei tu tur thil hi I omdon din alanga zanin kan webinar kan paper ngai tha kha chang te le ni zan lama te po kan ngai thak to kha kan be se na sang tak min siama linguist kan ni lowa kan linguist te chan han la ula akong po project te le engam po ko ngala in hong se don te na langa lom thu alom om ka tia enge he webinar po hi chumviata na I kong hong tu pakhat ani thei don te point kan sia alom om ka ti hle maya I paper ngai noma ngai to na akai shoi thui le meya be se na sang tak nen kan lo thlir reng ton chu ni ti kha kan soi do ni chu ni mai ro se alom le mai
alom me kan nei cho di le midang kan la om mo kan lo chon zo na pakhat lek tu na khan kan nei cho di khan ron soya e Mizoram sarkarin Mizo language board din turin mala chome ka nakum budget se sona ke na bil hi pudlu man tumin ro man nan siama abila po hi in kim mai pe thokhat to ni in kan fia dana kan lo ria ni chuan nakuma budget se sona te bil pudlu pa sa ni chuan rules te lo nei chuan chumi nuwa chuan language board po lian tak pui tham tak din tum ni in kan lo ria emi language board lo din tur hi eng ang tak atangkai tur angin nge i be se ya chu eng tin nge Mizo tong zirzel na tan le Mizo tong ham that na tan hian enge idu thu sam iti mai tiang tu na chon du thu lo sam theilai po ania ta chon eng angin nge lo be se eng ang ni turin nge idu tia kha toiten min chan sak theim
tuna chuan I base kan te chu ma chuan du ka sei pop me anga ri lampang ka khoita phonetician kan ni angin ri lampanga po han ke ma rengot thian ka zero wa han atok lo ka ti hle ni chu ke ma na tho po hi chu ma chuan ri le thu ka khan really thuk really hemi ri kan ne hemi thuk kan ne ti kha tok lo zir tur tam lu to ko chwa cha hemi lama research kan trong I phonetics lampang rengot lo morphology syntax kan ti lama te han project hi khoi de chur churila chan I kan project khoi kan ti khan I heta kan chalai te kan zirlai Mizo subject la te po hian khoi tel se entunan linguistic kai shoin noya khan khoi zur theila ka ti hengti I du thu sam phe chuan linguistic subject Mizo subject na chena ka soi ang khan Mizo subject Mizo noya hian subject pakhat angin semester 10 te hian zirtir ve theilang I a level niamte tengin phonetics atang te pon kanin zir theita engemo anol pui a generalize a theory a basic chu kanin thiamtir ve thehian ka ringani MLA BA level a po hian chu chunglama te po chuan ma laila chuan chunglama ma kan lak thei chuan entirnan chu enge kalo be se vedana chuan project ang chi ang zong te po chuan khoi chho thei te lang heta subject anga no thalai te kan lo zirtir thei to chuan enge a basic knowledge nei chuan project anga te po khan an lu chho ve thei ze langa kangai chu mi ani na chuan materials te po hi atam pha ka ringa chuwang chuan I chu ka be se na ani technical analysis lama mason
apoi mo khop mai nia language board loading tur hi kan urlok na sa khop maya ei program te pola om chozel don ni in ka ria hemi mo na tur program te po hi tunai soi research technical analysis tak tak kha kan mo chho le dona chuda chuan language board po hi funding agency te po ni ve hemi research scholar te tan po a begin linguistic lama research scholar te tan po funding agency an ni ve te po kha thula ni research hemi technical analysis atang lo chuan thila fel lei thei lo ti zani na po kan ngai tha khatiang chi te kharon kalpui thei se tha le maya tak taka chuan nia linguist hote in poimo le don ani he thila hian ya khani ya kan trong tu line kan har thara voina mi pakhat pe chuan revolution hi thleng ni bera ka ngai Mizo literature le language lama hian he hi apoimo em ani buai nuai a omlo chuan chin fel thei ani ngai lova kan han buaya kan han in nial te hi chin fel na tur ma hruai ani e ti ina soya angai no mangreng khopin ka ria chuwang chuan nang ni ho te le kan mithiam lo chuak le zel tur te be se na sang tak nen kan lo thlir cheu ani e zan in kan resource person te pani chunga lom thu kan soya angai nom du le maya zo na
DM zo na kan lo zot
la
zar kan ya
kan prince
kan resource person kha zo na kan zo ve du lok chu ka volume down do ni mo sorry nia a beng var thak le maya pi marina ile pi tlei pui te principal kan ang point lom thu ko soya kaipun layman ngai thakin ka lo ngai tha ve charchara a then kha chu ka the thiam phalo ma se ni mo chena ka lok ve len ka ria kami tu na kan han ngai thak nu nung ber atang phei kha chuan kami kan linguistic Mizo department Mizo noya English noya ni lo Mizo noya omse hanti vel te kha in national education policy nen kalo lakopa athadon mange o ma ni ma dartang engkim zirhi I thili concept kan mana kan thiam theizel boka ti te kalo ngai tua ti chuan syllabus revision a huna po engemo thon thu then khat kha chok thenin linguistic basic engemo te po kha Mizo BA course khan vat zelu sham dan unit ni emolek talemo ati khan han tel so zeu dan chu omse thilpoi mo tak ani ka ria kan soi du atin ka zo du tak zo ka chu tu na hian linguistic Mizo hian eng ange ka nei master degree ate tin net te hi angai ve tho tura kan ngai net nei te hi eng ange khalai ve la kha resource human resource kha thil ria chak de na kan ya kan vice chancellor hian PG hong tur hian min nor renga linguistic te hi kan ru kan lo tin zone de tak ani a chuti rualin Mizo MA kan nei to Mizo noi han omle tur kha chuan hupur don in ka ria maro chu mishing kan Mizo puite nge an hi chuan ma han lak te hi chak oma vaila lut tur rimot department tharan sual chu ai hi chuan ti te ka ru tela a human resource lama khan kanin to delem ti kan zon lok te ang
I linguistic kan tam to re to ka ke hi ke ma hian kan tuna hian iflu hian junior lerin diki a ombokta alra diki ombokta chumi ba ka chuan nehua khan mania Mizo department lama tengin nehua zuglu te linguistic subject pass wa khi ombokta ni hian PhD lama wai pui don boka opia ania chuan chumi ba ka chan IIT Guwahati a khwan mi pathum mi pahni an oma Tetsio University Tetsio College Nagaland ta hian Tetsio College tingi Tetsio College a hian pakhat Wendy ombokta chuan JNU lama po hian an omve bok ka shat swalo chuan MA a hian linguistics pass chhuak tuna han kan junior anama ani hi zero zum zela tumem ka shelo net te chu angai ania net hi linguistics a hian omve wang hian net hi angai ve ma se net hi an nei deuh tlang pui ni ka hmel sha te ho chuan
kalom ne tu ke kalome
kan principal Dr. Professor Ejlal Thanzara chunga kan lo me ani kha zanina po min la top thak thlengin min ho theya kan lom tak zeta ama kha ka muwa ma ro chu han song kha kan in tharung dewa emidang dang pu lal Dr. Kelal dai lovate le in ming kalam vek seng love kan senior za tak tak te top thlengin min ho theya kan lom hle maya zanin kan paper ngai thak angai nom in kan hlok pui viau maya tamzok po hian zo du kan zo lo na chan nia ka hria da chu kan an thu soya kha kan tlalu tuka kami kha kan pompui tlang hle ni ti kha alangin ka hria chuwang chuan kan ril ruwa chuan engemaw te nau han zo du te chu om mai the ma se kan in thlung deuh te pawni mai theye kan hlok le mai zanina kan thu soi tu pani Dr. Marina ile Dr. Tleipui te chunga kan lo mani chuan kan hun top lam kan lo nai don toanga nizan lama te program thatak mai kan nei theya ti chuan zanina kan chhun zom le ti chuan zanina top khanan lom thu soina hun mang turin Dr. Lal nun puya ren thei nununa lom thu soi turin lo somang
kan zanin hun min ka shoi tu kan senior teacher som tak Dr. Echelin moya chunga kalome zanin kan webinar lo chim tu jong te in zain Department of Mizo Pachu University College on chipai kan book tak meu chewa zena hin hei lom te soi tur men ruata ka lom te soi na kha aka pa de umei thaya min lo sha thiam tawla e tun chum kan webinar hi Pachu University College Department of Mizo in kanan bo sai ania chuan HRDB Human Resource Development Board state sarkar noi Department of School Education noya mi khan sponsor ania kan petron po he kan emile zom tak HRDB Vice Chairman pu el thang moya ania hei han select donila webinar te seminar te thil han ti don hian sum te angai thina thopui te kan mo thina chunga te chu kan thopui thei kan lo me te kan sui a ti chu ni zana khan ha kan Mizo Tawng Dinhmun le Hmathlir ti kan webinar program zan khanna tan khan Dr. Rema Chakchua kan han so makhania anin lotling takin hunam manga a topic kha Mizo Tawng hum hal le ti hasom ti khania ani hi tun kumin tho August tha Mizo pathum khane tan ka sia khami tum khanin special lecture nei tu kan department kan lo som to lotling takin kan lo soma chu kan zong chang da vi maya kan department chu kan ta nei ta hle ni ti kha kan soya chuan Dr. Rema lakin zela po hian kan thopui chun zom chaw zeu the to chu kan nga ya khala khanang ma poilo in kaw kan be sei hal ta sela Mizo Tawng chungchanga language chungchanga hian ke ni department a hi nge language and literature han khoi kop kan ni thina wa hian nang ni hoi kan ma mo chun zom zeu don chu ti kan sei duwa Dr. Rema Chakchua zain thlenga min la tel pui min la hun min la man pui the hi lom thu kan soi tak me wani ti kha kan soi len ta sela ti chuan ni zana khanin kan program kha min han kan program min hon saktu kha Dr. Vanachan puya kan MLS om takani ani kha Mizoram Youth Commission MOIC chairman ani boka ani hi kan thopui the kan lom khop maya bokana tin thu soi ngainom tang mai kan ngai tha ni zana khan Dr. Professor H L Thanzara kan Pachung University College kan principal som tak mai in thu soi ngainom tang mai le bengwar tha tang mai in han nei saka kan lom tak zeta ti chuan hei kan department Mizo department hi Pachung University College kan department Mizo department hi kan principal ti kan thopui tha thei ko pin kan sia kan ta nei ve thine ti moyang Dr. Tone nga po ka ma kan principal chota po ka kan thopui chakho mai ni po kan ta nei seminar sang sang webinar sang sang hian mi kha hun kha man pui thina i mun la zo ka lungle te champaya te po ti khain mi kha zui zel thina kha nia ani ho khan thil kan ti thina lom thu kan soi tak me ba e kan principal te re kan thopui thina tu na po kan Professor H L Thanzara kan principal song tang mai kan thopui chole theite ani na thatak me mina ten sak theite e sain thing hun min la man pui ti kan sia ani po lom thu kan chil tak me wani ti kan sei duwa ki chuanin hei zania hiana san dina kun kan hmang leta Dr. Marina angur sang zeri behra kha ani khan hun kha ar mang Mizo Tawng nam ni na le nun phung shil tu Mizo language the essence of culture and identity ti kha ngainom takin an soya sap tong soya ni na khanin kan zain kan shet yemin nge ne kan lo ngai thathiam tur kan ngaya chu apomen ka chu kan nei to hlom thawa chu ma chen soi zau to lo mai nga ani chu an lom thu kan soi tak me ba tin nge session ni na hianin Dr. Lal Tli pui ani hian Mizo Tawng linguistic analysis lama Hmathlir ti kha Mizo language prospects of linguistic analysis ti kha tuna kharon mang le kha nia paper ngainom tak tak kan ngai thale theita zaina kan resource person te pani chunga khan lom thu kan soi tak me mani ti kha nia chuan Dr. Rema kan soi tong deu khan ni pani po hi nakin zela hian webinar ni mo seminar ni mo kan thopui zui zel du kha anni karinga department chu kan kau zela e zain changian kan ta nei chole do ni ti kha kan lo soi lo ka anni po khan kan department hi ron ta nei sela in ta ni ti kha kan soi le ani e chuan kan program te hi min hoi kan program min hoi ho saktu coordinator hi kan department head zong tak mai PNit HL Ramone ania ani hi kan coordinator ania ani kai suen noya webinar loading tang mai kan nei hi lomom tak zeta achunga polom thu kan sui ani chuan coordinator hi coordinator thop tu hi kan zirtir tu tho ro thuanga assistant professor department of Mizo Pachung University College ania ani chunga pon lom thu kan soi tak me ba anni pani hianin theito pin tuna kan webinar hi ruam pan sang sang te siamin man lo la chawni ti ka kan soi do ti chuan tuna zaina kan hun mang tu kan hun kai soi tu Dr. H L Din mo e po hi akula taya tang ning lang lem lo chin hi ania ani chunga pon lom thu kan soi po ka ti chuan kan petron hi kan soi tong khan min sponsor tu kan MLA zom tak il thangmo ya vice chairman human resource development board HRDB khania ani chunga pon lom thu kan soi tak me ban ni ho tang khomina zanin hun hi kan webinar kan tun tum webinar hi min bu sai sakan ni ti kha kan soi ne ta se ti chuan ei audience song song te ni zan lam pang le zanin lama kan audience song song te chunga lom thu kan soi tak me ba kan audience ten shol lom ko me kan principal thangin zain at pomin hun min la man pui kan ti to kha alom thu kan soi tak me ba hai Germany tang point Michael Baila last name ka lam sol pa mai tia ani chunga pon lom thu kan soya in hei zaina hian hei college sang sanga kan professor te tinem zatiu lama kan department of Mizo lama kan zirti tu sar sang jol te in mun sang sanga changa college sang sanga changa assistant professor te la kan professor lo kan zirti tu senior tak tak te pon kan hun melon man puya kan lo tin na khain ni ti kha kan soi du tin comment thatak tak mai in train kan han tong song thei boka kan han ngai thei boka lom thu kan soi tak me bani tin zilai tam takin hei kan hun hi menon chim boka menon chim sak boka chunga khan lom thu ka soi tak me ba ni chuan kan soi to kha kan ngai tha Mizo language board te poding chu mai tur kha ni a lo ting chawani chuan in ti hian kan program hi ati hian lo thonin kal mai don lawa ti mayang chung changa hian seminar te webinar hi tam to ko maya Mizo chung changa tin MA lampang point khil sing ve workshop ti te engemaw hi tam khop to maya tin engemaw lecture taila thil engemaw han chai khom point chunga bo kan lu le thin ti te hi ani thina ma ro chu thil hi pathian thu soyang deuh hi ne kan chung changa po hian hi zir to phiom lem lawa zir chun zom zel turania hi nin nge aning zong kan ngai tu lawa mason zong thil kan thir hi atang kai khop don te kan soi ne ta sela ti chuan kan paper te ngai dom lom khop maya som na te pe chuan siam sela chuan in kan in lam deuh chup thein kan ringa thinom khoveng zong hria ta hin ne na kan puang chu le te kha soi thei lo ne in kha ni ya lomom khop maya eng po ni se language bo te din huna pe chuan zoram pum hianin ne na te po kan lop puang chur dung chu ti ba kha ni ya kha lom thu kan soi tak me bani zaina audience zong te le kan resource person te kan principal zong tak te le kan hun min ka shoi tu te le department of Mizo te in za chunga lom thu soi tak me ve lo me
lom me Dr. Lang nun puyarin thlei sarnu nuna chunga kan lo me kha chat box lama khan feedback form kha a link kharon dania kha certificate du tele atiang mamo te tan chuan kha feedback kha pengai turin kan hanin somin kan hanin nge na tin zanina lo ni zan lama tel zanina lo tel man talo te po om the ne wangin emi webinar kual bi ka WhatsApp group kan siama khana link po kha ron po sanianga khamiya feedback pe lo tan kha chuan certificate kha buai thak thrina chawang chuan khalai feedback kha pe turin kan hanin so mani lezan ina he kan webinar ron chim tu zong te in zawai chunga lom thu kan soya in hun lutak senga in ron telawangin kan loma a big takin kan resource person ni zan lama mi pure machak chuak te tin zanina Dr. Marina te Dr. Tleipui te tin kan principal za tak Dr. Professor Ejlal Thanzara te le zirtir tu dang zong te zirlai te in zawai chunga lom thu kan soye